Good day, everybody. Welcome to this webinar about how green electric vehicles are. As we say, they're greener than you might think. My name's Larry Cretion. I'm the director of the nonprofit Green Energy Consumers Alliance. And with me today is Mal Skorin, a program associate in our electric car program, which we call Drive Green. Mal did most of the work on this presentation, which is actually we're going to walk you through a blog that Mal and I wrote a few weeks ago, and we hope you enjoy it. We hope that it provides you some appreciation about how much our grid is getting cleaner all the time and why electric cars are one of the things that we need to do to reduce the emissions that cause global warming. There will be opportunities for questions as we go. Some logistics. We've muted everybody simply because we are up over 30 attendees, and we just want to avoid background noise. But it's lunchtime, so we'll help yourself to any lunch that you might want while you listen in. There'll be regular breaks for questions, and with those questions, there's a question box. So send your questions into that, and Mal and I will answer those when we go to the regular breaks in the action. Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we're celebrating our 39th year actually, and our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We have a variety of programs that consumers can tap into. Green electricity, electric cars, we call that program Drive Green. You can get solar panels through us. You can learn about how to shave the peak on electricity. We're working with communities in Massachusetts and Rhode Island on a big new program called Green Municipal Aggregation. We do what we can to give consumers a meaningful opportunity to save the planet and to hopefully save money at the same time. But we also have an advocacy program where we've got Eugenia Gibbons in Massachusetts and Kai Salem in Rhode Island, who go and they work with state and local public officials to try to move the needle on public policy. So we feel like we need to do both, get better public policy and take whatever actions we can as consumers. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Mal, who will run through the agenda with you, and then she'll dig into the details, and I'll be helping her look for the questions.
Thank you, Larry. Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today. So here's what we have coming up for this webinar. So first, I'll be talking a little bit about what the emissions level between different vehicles actually is today. So a comparison between gas-powered vehicles and electric vehicles, specifically in New England. Then I'll be diving into a little bit of state level policy for green energy, because as we all know, electric cars are as green as the electricity used to charge them. And so state level policy for renewable energy actually makes a big difference in terms of EV emissions now and in the coming years. Then I'll be talking a little bit more about Green Municipal Aggregation, which is the program that Larry mentioned, as a community level initiative in order to increase the amount of renewable energy on the grid. And then finally, I'll wrap up by talking about what all of those policies mean for EV emissions over time. So many people disregard the environmental benefits of electric cars because some electricity is generated from fossil fuels. So their thinking goes, because coal-fired power plants exist, there's no way electric cars are better at reducing climate warming emissions than gas-powered cars. And to some extent, that is true. Electric cars are only as clean as the electricity we use to charge them. But the good news is that the resources used to generate electricity vary regionally, and New England happens to have a pretty clean grid, in addition to some other regions in the US as well. So although there are coal-fired and oil-fired power plants in some states, those really only turn on for a few of the hottest days of the year to meet peak demand. So that's when energy use is really high, and they're only used occasionally just because they are so expensive. And so the Union of Concerned Scientists has this tool online where you can put in your zip code, and then it gives you an estimate of how many grams of CO2 are released for every mile that you drive, depending on the energy mix used in your region. And so we found that by switching to an electric car in New England, you can reduce your per mile emissions by 75% overnight. So that means that by switching to an electric car, you can cut down on your carbon footprint by about the same amount that will be required in every sector of the economy in 30 years, which is quite substantial. And this assumes that the average gas guzzler gets 29 miles to the gallon, and that is the average in 2020. But lots of cars, especially older clunkers that are being replaced, get worse mileage than that. And this model also includes the indirect emissions associated with each fuel source. So the EV number accounts for the mining and delivery of fuels to power plants as well. But there are a lot of ingrained emissions for gas-powered cars because of the need to extract crude oil, transport it, and convert it to gasoline, and that entire process. So this number includes kind of everything involved with actually being able to refuel your vehicle with gasoline. However, it is likely that this number is conservative because producing and transporting gasoline and diesel fuels is actually more emissions intensive than what most estimates assume. And also, oil extraction will only continue to get more emissions intensive because as we continue to deplete reserves that are easily accessible, we have to drill in deeper, more unconventional areas that have a greater impact on emissions overall. So it is likely that this estimate for gas-powered cars is conservative. In addition to a clean energy grid, EVs benefit from high efficiency compared to gas guzzlers. So combustion engine cars waste a lot of energy through heat output, and they have hundreds of moving parts like fuel pumps that use the gasoline's energy but don't actually contribute to the car's motion. So that means only about 17 to 21% of the available energy of gasoline is converted to miles driven, compared to 77% for the electricity used to drive electric cars. So in other words, it takes about 4 times the amount of energy to move a gas-powered car than it does an electric car. And then you can also see this reflected when you compare efficiency between different cars. So here is a graph that compares the MPG and MPGE, which is miles per gallon equivalent. And it's a measure of how many miles you'll get from the energy contained in a gallon of gasoline. So it's a way for us to compare efficiency on an apples-to-apples basis using a scale that we're all familiar with. So notice that even the most fuel-efficient gas car, which is the Toyota Prius hybrid listed here, still consumes about twice the energy of the least efficient electric car listed here, which is the Tesla Model X. And also notice that the Tesla Model X is a largish SUV, and it still is more energy efficient than the Prius, which is known to be one of the more efficient gas-powered cars, and it's, you know, a relatively small sedan. And so by driving an electric car, you're not only reducing your demand for oil specifically, but you're consuming less energy overall to travel the same number of miles. And that efficiency is why EVs are lower emissions intensive than gasoline-powered cars, even though some of our electricity still comes from fossil fuels. So efficiency definitely helps the environmental benefits of EVs and will continue to do so. Also notice that there is still quite a variety among the different EVs. Because of the differences in efficiency, a car like the Chevy Bolt only emits 84 grams of CO2 per mile driven, compared to the New England average of 96 grams per mile. And then on the other side of that, sportier and larger electric vehicles are less efficient than the average EV, but still blow similarly sized gas guzzlers out of the water. So if you do drive one of the more efficient and smaller EVs, your impact on emissions is even greater than you might think. And I will mention the Union of Concerned Scientists tool is online, so you can actually plug in the exact model and year of the vehicle that you drive or are thinking about driving, and then it'll give you that exact number for you. So this is a special Earth Day webinar. I would be remiss without mentioning the fact that tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day, which was organized just months before the Clean Air Act was first passed in 1970. And that was before the impacts of climate change were widely understood and apparent. And clean air was the major battleground issue for environmentalists. And yet, 50 years later, gasoline vehicles, in addition to contributing the majority of transportation emissions in the region, are also the leading source of harmful air pollution in Massachusetts. So if you live in eastern Massachusetts specifically, you might have noticed that the air has been a little cleaner over the last couple of weeks. And that mostly has to do with the fact that fewer people are driving. So you can see that impact of gasoline-powered cars on air. That's because combustion engines emit nitrogen and sulfur oxides, which cause acid rain and contribute to ground-level ozone formation. You might know ozone as the gas that protects against UV rays from the sun when it's higher in the atmosphere, but at ground level, ozone is actually the smog that makes air feel thick and heavy, especially in the summertime. And that's because summertime air pollution is the worst because the seasonal heat speeds up the chemical reactions that form ozone. So you actually kind of feel that thicker, heavier air more so in the summertime for that reason. But the worst for human health is actually PM 2.5, which is particulate matter that is less than 2.5 microns in diameter, which is about 20 times smaller than the width of human hair. It's essentially really fine soot, which doesn't sound like it would be that harmful, but PM 2.5 is the air pollution that is responsible for 3 to 4 million deaths every year in the world. So it's really quite bad for respiratory health. And you can see on the map on the screen there that the highest concentration of PM 2.5 is in the Boston metro area, where you have the highest density of gasoline vehicles and the nexus of multiple large highways in the area. And this comes with healthcare costs that people must take the burden of. So in Massachusetts, bad air quality is responsible for nearly $2 billion in healthcare costs due to increased respiratory and cardiovascular issues. And this is what comes with unnecessary ER visits, premature deaths, lost work days, asthma attacks, and heart attacks. So all of those things contribute to those costs. And in a time where we're probably all more cognizant of the fragility of our respiratory health and our health in general, it is important to remember that this type of bad air quality makes everyone more vulnerable to the impacts of respiratory disease. And so multiple studies have shown that even when electric vehicles are charged with electricity generated from burning fossil fuels, they're still a net good for air quality. And that's because pollution from cars is a local problem. Wherever there are the most tailpipes, that's where you get the most pollution. So if you can remove tailpipes, you're putting fewer people at risk. So today, by switching to an electric car, that's a positive impact that you're having for your family and for everyone around you. So EVs really are a public health tool and help improve air quality. So I've talked a little bit about the environmental benefits of electric vehicles, both for climate warming emissions and for air quality. If anyone has any questions, let's see. I think Larry would be happy to answer them. Do we have any questions, Larry?
Yes, there's a question from Nathan that honestly I'm having a little difficulty reading at the moment. Can you see it?
Yes, I do. I think it's a question about time of use rates and reduced electricity costs related to that policy.
Well, there's in general what we can say about electricity rates. Typically, we're all signed up for a monthly rate. Usually in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, if you're on utility basic service, the rate does not change for 6 months at a time. It's kind of fixed. If you're in a community with an aggregation, the rate might be fixed for 2 or 3 years. But there's a growing recognition that there are benefits to what's called time of use pricing, which is it can vary. It might be much lower off peak than peak. And by that, typically what we mean is the normal workday roughly might be a peak period, certainly from say 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then it becomes where most of the demand for electricity is. And then at night and on weekends, the demand falls off sharply, and that reduces the load on the system. We're already seeing a huge drop in demand as a result of COVID, but in general, there's a peak and off-peak situation going on with electricity, and it really benefits us all when people charge their vehicles off-peak. The cost to the system is much less, both in terms of electricity generation, but also in terms of it reduces transmission cost, it reduces distribution cost, and so it's actually better for everybody, including people who don't have an electric vehicle, if you charge off peak. There are also some how the emissions change from peak to off peak can vary a bit, and we certainly would encourage someone who might have solar panels on their roof to try to charge their car up when the sun is shining at your home, and then you'd be able to store it at another time. Other questions, Mel?
Yes, I see a couple of questions about where we got the stats on the healthcare costs due to poor air quality. So those actually came from a report produced by the American Lung Association. I know for sure that it is on our website under the public health section, but I can also send it around after the webinar in case people are interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, so I see a couple more questions. Do the values that we have where we count emissions, are they associated with the production of the vehicles? You just want to take another swing at that one, Mel?
Sure, yeah, I can answer that. So the values that I was talking about are on a per mile basis. So they're looking at once the cars are on the road. The unit of concern scientists also took a look at life cycle emissions in order to try and figure out whether manufacturing changed things significantly. And they found that battery production definitely increases the emissions associated with manufacturing an electric car compared to a gasoline-powered car, but that still, over the lifetime of the vehicle, emissions would be improved on about 50% less. So it's not quite as high as the 75% basis, but I also believe that their life cycle study was looking at nationwide averages and not just New England as well. So the exact number for New England is probably a little higher than 50%, a little less than 75% if you are accounting for emissions from manufacturing as well.
Yep. Another question was, I want to get back to Nathan's question about how much longer do we have to wait before we see the time of use plans? And actually, we know that National Grid in Massachusetts and Rhode Island is trying to roll out pilot programs for that. And we're actually encouraging them to move forward. They've been very good about it. We actually think the regulators in Massachusetts and Rhode Island are a little bit slower than they should be on that topic. So we're hoping to see time of use pricing happen quicker. We think the benefits are there for that. And then one last question, we can move on. Dennis is asking questions about what about tires on electric cars and the particulate matter that they cause, and that's actually a good point. I've learned, and Mal, you probably know more than I do, but just running tires across the road produces particulate matter to a significant extent, and that's true. But electric cars would not produce any more tire-based particulate matter than a gasoline-powered car. Another form of particulate matter has to do with friction brakes, and on that one, electric cars would generally score much better than internal combustion cars, because one of the coolest features of newer electric cars is that you can do what's called one pedal driving, which is, and I do that all the time in my Chevy Bolt, which is when you take your foot off the accelerator. It's not a gas pedal, it's an accelerator. The car will actually start slowing down. And on certain cars like the Chevy Bolt and the Teslas, the regenerative braking that you get and the stopping power is sufficient. It can actually stop the car at some point if you don't put your foot back down on the accelerator. And then there's a paddle up on the steering wheel that you can put into play as well. And I actually like to see if I can drive for 15, 20 minutes or an hour without actually putting my foot on the foot brake. And so generally what that means is you put much less wear and tear on the friction pads of the physical brakes of the car, and that therefore means you're putting less particulate matter into the air.
Great. Okay. I think there are a couple more questions, but it looks like they might be answered as we continue. So I'll move on. So I keep mentioning the Union of Concerned Scientists. It estimates that the average EV in New England emits 96 grams per mile, 96 grams of CO2 per mile in 2020. And that's the number that you get whether you live in Boston, Providence, Stamford, Burlington, or Portland, so anywhere in New England. And that's because their tool uses regional data, because all New England states share the same electricity transmission system. So in theory, if all the power generating resources in Rhode Island were maxed out and demand was greater than supply, then you could use a power plant in New Hampshire to balance the grid and make sure that energy demand is met across the region. And also all utility companies in the region are drawing on the same pool of resources. So that means that ISO New England, which manages all of the power generating resources in the region, can afford or can assure affordability and reliability in the system. However, there is a little bit more nuance to it, the energy system than that. because even though the region shares a distribution network and a pool of energy resources, each independent state can have different renewable energy laws that require utility companies operating in that state to have a certain amount of renewable energy resources for their customers. And so depending on where you live, the resource mix that your utility uses will vary according to the state laws that are in place there. So even though it's the ISO's job to ensure low costs and system reliability for everyone, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, is a mandate that requires utility companies like National Grid or Eversource to enter contracts with renewable energy suppliers that meet this mandate in the state that they operate in. So that in time will make the entire region greener. And I should mention that in some states, this policy is known as an RES, or a renewable energy standard, but they do the same thing. So you can see in the comparison on the screen there that since this is a state level policy, different states will move at different paces to adopt renewable energy. And that means depending on where you live and where you charge your electric car, the impact of the car and its emissions will actually change over time. And that's for the better, because more renewable energy means that a cleaner electricity grid and a cleaner running EV. And so that means that electric cars under this policy will get greener every year. And so this is a good snapshot of what's going on right now. But at any time, a state can choose to enact stronger policy that would change this graph for the better. So what does this mix look like if you live in Massachusetts and Rhode Island? Right now, nearly 40% of the energy mix is zero emitting resources. And this is kind of a dual analysis of National Grid and Eversource, which are the two dominant utilities in the region, and they're both pretty similar for our purposes here. So if you look at the energy mix on any given day, it is mostly zero emission resources, especially on sunny days when solar production is at a max. But the grid has never been greener than this, which is very exciting. But in general, this is what it looks like. And you'll notice that of the 41% of fossil fuels, the majority is mostly natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, but it is not as emissions intensive or as oil or coal. And again, I've mentioned this before, but oil and coal are really only used during periods of extremely high energy usage. And many of these resources are on their way out in the state. So for example, a couple of years ago, the coal burning power plant at Brayton Point in Somerset, I believe it was closed down. So a lot of these resources are on their way out in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And it's also important to note that depending on when electricity usage is very high, the percentage of zero emission resources can actually increase. So for example, lately people have been staying home and using more energy on the residential level. And so that's been kind of changing energy usage patterns in a way that has actually melded really quite nicely with the solar production in the region. So I think I was looking at a live view of the energy mix, what it looked like on a Wednesday of last week or whatever. And it was almost nearly 60% of the energy being produced was all renewable. So it's looking good for the region. But there is a lot of room for improvement, and in Massachusetts, it's mostly mandated by state law. So in 2008, the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act mandated economy-wide greenhouse gas emission reductions of 25% below the 1990 level and 80% below 2050, or by 2050, excuse me. And the RPS, which is the main policy driver to try and help accomplish this goal, has been around for as long as the Global Warming Solutions Act. But in 2018, the Clean Energy Standard was actually added as a supplement to the policy in order to help meet these goals. So we do see kind of like a stronger push. And the graph shown there shows what the clean electricity requirements will be all the way through 2050. However, there continues to be growing political momentum outside and within the State House to change the 2050 goal to be 100% net zero emissions. So that would mean that this would have to be further updated in order to meet 100% clean electricity by 2050. And it would also mean that we would need to reduce emissions about 3% every year from now moving forward. And so by establishing good policy for emissions reduction in the electricity sector, which has been done, and it seems like there's more momentum to keep that going, it ensures that electric vehicles in Massachusetts will get cleaner every year. So renewable energy requirements are kind of like a 2-for-1 deal, because in addition to reducing emissions from the electricity sector, it's also decreasing the impact of each electric vehicle that will be on the road in the future. Unfortunately, the RES policy could use some work in Rhode Island. In January, you might have heard that Governor Raimondo in Rhode Island announced that she had a goal of 100% renewable energy for the state by 2030. And this did receive a lot of positive press all over the country. But unfortunately, this was an executive order. It's aspirational and not concrete policy. So while I'm glad that Governor Raimondo has this goal, when the next governor is elected, there's nothing that ensures that they will stick to this same goal. And so in order to make sure that Rhode Island is staying on track, the legislature, would actually need to improve the policy that is on the books right now in order to mandate that the utility companies actually stick to 100% renewable energy by 2030. As it stands, the mandate in Rhode Island is significantly weaker than the laws in Massachusetts and some other neighboring states. The mandate in Rhode Island ends at 2035 at only about 38.5% renewable energy, and it's been very difficult to mobilize Rhode Island legislators to pass additional climate legislation. And so, while this could change, this is the pathway that we see for Rhode Island currently. Okay. But overall, in terms of new generation resources, there is some room for optimism because mandates are a good driver for renewable energy development. And here we see some information from the system operator in New England that is summarizing proposed interconnections for the regional electricity system in New England. And we see that many of the projects that are in the pipeline are kind of being able to be supported because of improving technology and also better incentives. So renewable energy projects are capital intensive. They're not very expensive to run because the fuel is free, but they are expensive to develop. And so renewable energy developers really rely on these additional incentives and guaranteed purchase agreements to ensure that their projects are profitable. So this policy does work, and we want to continue to be able to incentivize additional renewable energy development. And note here that the majority of the projects that are coming online, or at least are proposed to come online in the next couple of years, are offshore wind. So it's about 13,000 megawatts of offshore wind projects. So things are looking good. And with that, I'll take a break for questions.
Mel, Russell asked, do we want to comment on Brookline and other towns outlawing gas hookups on new houses? Well, as an organization, we encourage communities to look at anything that they can do to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And that's a pretty substantial policy that a community could take. Just it's a little bit off the point of our webinar today, though, but I think we're trying to get at the same thing, which is we're trying to turn the spigot down on all fossil fuels, including natural gas, which is really methane. And one way to do it is by outlawing hookups, but we can also displace natural gas and other fossil fuels by adding renewable energy over time. So that would be our comment on that question. Dennis asked again, what's the wind, solar, hydro, nuke? What's the mix? Which are going up or down, and which will stay the same? Well, just to get back to one of the points that Mal was saying, in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and the other states, there are things called renewable energy standards that require by state law increasing amounts of wind and solar and actually hydro. And so we're going to see over time those sources will grow percentage-wise and in absolute terms, and they will displace mostly fossil fuels. And in New England, as Mal pointed out, the oil and coal are pretty much out of the mix, except for very extreme times of the year. And so the wind, solar, and hydro will displace natural gas. Nuclear power plants will probably continue to run for as long as they're licensed. However, they are under some pressure economically, and so we don't know that they'll be around forever. In our view, it seems very unlikely that another new nuclear power plant will be permitted in Massachusetts or Rhode Island and maybe anywhere else in New England. So over time, the grid will be adding more renewable energy resources, zero emission resources, and at the expense of emitting resources. And as we also pointed out, aside from what's required by law, so many communities in both states are moving to aggregation. They're adding more renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, onto the mix. So we're trying to accelerate that point, and Mal's going to get to that in a minute. One Russell asks again, how many stats on how many EV owners opt for green electricity supply or own the rooftop solar? We don't have good hard statistics because they're kind of held by different folks, but we know that our program, our organization, does offer green electricity and solar, and we know that there's a pretty good cross-pollination between that. And I have seen surveys that say that a lot of EV owners have solar panels on their roof, a pretty high correlation as you would expect, but there's no definitive governmental source that we can point to. I think you'll see more and more of that. Essentially, it's the same type of consumer, people who are looking forward and trying to do the right thing. Then can we link us to the source of the info for the National Grid Eversource Energy Mix? If you were to go to the websites or Google National Grid or Eversource, look for the disclosure label. Or if you look in your electricity bill, every quarter the utilities are required to submit what's called a disclosure label, which breaks out where they're getting their resources from. And the slide that we showed was essentially our combination of the two. A National Grid and Eversource have pretty much the same mixes, so we just sort of averaged them and put them together, and we added up the non-emitting resources and put them in one bucket, and then we put the emitting resources into another bucket. And then Bruce asked, why do you think that New Hampshire does not have higher goals for renewable energy sources? Excellent question. It all comes down to what the government's going to do about that, and that has to do, so So an example of where elections matter and where people need to express their views on to their legislators and to their governors what kind of resources they want in their electricity mix. So New Hampshire from time to time has done some very progressive things in the area of the environment, but I think it's lagging right now behind most other New England states. So hopefully they'll catch up.
Yeah, also just to
Let's
add
see.
to that,
Yep.
I know Maine was pretty similar to New Hampshire a couple of years ago, and then they had this like renaissance of leadership that kind of has really taken the charge on things like heat pumps, which also rely on electricity. And so really it just takes a couple of leaders that have a good vision for that. And they're just, yeah, it's not happening yet for New Hampshire.
Yep. So Mel, why don't you continue?
Great. Okay, will do. And I do see that it looks like there are plenty of questions coming in. So thank you everyone for sending those in, and we'll try and get to as many as we can as we finish up. So Green Municipal Aggregation is a model developed by green energy consumers with the help of some consultants at Good Energy in order to try and empower communities to take a step beyond what is required by state renewable energy portfolios. So it's been proven to add more Class 1 renewable energy in Massachusetts in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it's actually been saving ratepayers money in the process. So it's happening at a very affordable rate. And I'll be talking a little bit more about this. But you can learn everything that there is to know about GMA by reading the second edition of the report that was recently released by Green Energy Consumers online. So you can learn more there. And also Green Energy Consumers has a series specifically about how to implement GMA in your community, both that's Rhode Island specific and Massachusetts specific. I believe that's April 30th. So if you do want to learn more about how to implement this in your community, you can learn more there. But just as a kind of crash course in how GMA works, so it's a type of Community Choice Electricity Program. Basically, a city or town purchases electricity in bulk by negotiating with a competitive or third-party supplier. And so consumers right now can switch to a competitive supplier on their own in order to increase consumer choice. But studies conducted by the Massachusetts Attorney General's office have found that when individuals switch over from a utility, they tend to lose money in the long run. But GMA is a model in which that kind of purchasing of electricity is done on the community level. So what that does is it gives the community a lot of buying power in order to negotiate a much better price than what an individual could get on their own, and usually what the utility can offer as part of their basic service. And so the community does have a lot of leverage in order to be able to negotiate a good long-term rate for about 3 years. And we have some data on that as well. But according to the model, everyone in the community that is enrolled, that was on the utility's basic service, so that's what Eversource or National Grid provide, is automatically enrolled in the program, but they can opt out to continue receiving the price set by those utilities. But usually the more people that are in the aggregation, the lower costs that there are for everyone. So it makes sense as an opt-out system instead of opt-in. But what's special about the model of Green Municipal Aggregation is that the default option for consumers is 5% or more additional renewable energy beyond what is required by state law. And so we add 5% renewable energy because it's a substantial addition to what is required by state law, while pretty much ensuring cost savings for the community. So it's a way to have both. Many communities are choosing to go 10% above state requirements or even 30% above state requirements in order to maximize their emissions impact, or maximize their emissions reductions, I should say. But those communities are still being shown to have saved money through the process. So it's really a great model in order to be able to achieve all of those things. And what's really important about GMA in terms of its emissions reduction impact is the fact that it creates additionality. So ideally, we want renewable energy resources to be replacing the fossil fuel infrastructure in New England, because that's the only way we'll actually reduce emissions, right? Like, we don't want to be adding renewable energy without knowing that it's also displacing the need or demand for fossil fuels in the region. And so GMA has been proven to actually add more renewable energy in a way that makes a difference. And so a little bit about how that is monitored. So when you have a renewable energy project, let's say a wind turbine, its production of clean energy is counted through what's called a REC, or a renewable energy certificate. So when the wind turbine produces 1 megawatt hour of energy, it creates 1 REC as well. And so the owner of the renewable energy project can sell electricity from the wind turbine, and that's a source of income, but also they can sell the REC as well. And so that creates an additional source of revenue for renewable energy developers, and it helps keep track of renewable energy production. And so when utility companies are trying to meet the mandates that are put upon them by state law, they purchase and retire RECs in order to meet state RPS laws. And so the model of Green Municipal Aggregation kind of plays off of this, because when a community signs a long-term contract with an energy supplier that requires additional renewable energy, that buys up RECs and encourages further energy development for clean energy projects. So basically, GMA is creating an additional market to purchase renewable energy in a way that is boosting demand for those projects and creating an additional incentive to increase that amount of development. So it's basically playing keep away in order to make sure that we have more clean energy projects on the grid as fast as possible. And so GMA has been proven to save consumers money, save ratepayers money. This is a net good for everyone, but especially low-income households that spend a disproportionate amount of their income on energy bills. And so in addition to, adding renewable energy, which is a net good for everyone, it does have that cost savings as well. And so many communities also have the option to increase to 100% renewable energy. So people can opt up and pay a little more than what the default rate is. But even at 5, 10, 20% additional renewable energy, ratepayers in these communities are paying rates that are pretty comparable compared to what National Grid and Eversource are offering. So for those who can afford it, opting up to 100% is really making renewable energy easy to purchase and accessible for people. So this is a concrete thing that people living in a community can do in order to have a tangible impact. And I just want to draw attention to the fact that Arlington, Brookline, Somerville, and Winchester, which are all listed here, and all experienced savings as communities by opting to participate in a Green Municipal Aggregation. Several of those communities had contracts that have expired in November or December of last year, and they've all renewed, with Brookline opting up to 30% above the requirement. Somerville and Winchester are both at 10%, and Arlington is at 11% now as well. So you really see communities buying into this model and it's been effective for them. I will say there are lots of flavors of community choice aggregation, and not all of them are green. There are over 150 communities in Massachusetts that have chosen to participate in an aggregation, but many of them don't have the additional renewable energy content in the portfolio. So some have no renewable energy, some have 100% option, but many don't have the default opt up, so no additional 5% component. And that's what's really smart about the GMA model. And unfortunately, not everyone has that. And so we do want to encourage folks to try and, see what their community is doing. And, if you do have an option to opt up, that makes your electricity even greener. It probably makes the most sense. But unfortunately, some aggregations are also choosing to buy cheap renewable energy certificates from outside of the region, which doesn't have that additionality. So it's not displacing fossil fuel use in New England, and it's just supporting wind projects in Texas or wherever that don't actually need additional sources of funding in order to get off the ground. And so there are lots of different flavors here. But the point is that there are still many communities that haven't made the decision yet about what they're going to do. And lots of communities can benefit from this model. So in Rhode Island, the law changed to allow aggregation in 2017. And so some folks at Green Energy Consumers are working to make sure that the good example set in Massachusetts can be carried over to Rhode Island to try and maximize both savings for consumers and also try and increase the amount of renewable energy that we have. So I have just a few slides left, but let's take a quick break for questions before I get to those. Do we have any questions, Larry?
Yes, Russ asked, according to the statistics, EVs per state, California is at 10%, Vermont's at 2%, Massachusetts at 1%. What carrots and sticks would you advocate to improve the statistics for Massachusetts? Yes, that's something we're working very hard on in both states. We think that a combination of factors come into play. California is advantaged by the fact of its enormous size and the fact that it got into electric cars a few years before everybody else did. And so all the manufacturers, in order to comply with mandates, are selling to California. It's kind of old news, and it's up to the rest of the states now to catch up. We think that over time, EV adoption will increase as battery prices come down, making the car cheaper. The upfront cost is a big factor. Massachusetts had a rebate. If you go to a website called moreev.org, you can get information. And that was very important. It was a rebate of up to $2,500. Then they cut it to $1,500 at the state level. And now it's back up to $2,500. And there was a time when it ran out. And that sort of stopping and starting with the rebate is not effective. It makes it hard for consumers to know what to do. It's a key selling point for car dealerships to have that rebate. And so it wasn't good for Massachusetts to cut it or to eliminate it. States like California, New York, and Washington that have been more consistent have done a better job with that. And other countries such as Norway have had much more EV adoption. There's also an important factor is the number of charging stations that are publicly available. And on that one, we would say that the news is improving, and we'll be coming out with some more information on that as soon as it becomes available from the utilities. But in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, utilities have authorization to help provide incentives to companies and public agencies that want to build charging stations. And so the number of level 2 chargers in public places is increasing over time, and the number of what we call DC fast charging stations is increasing. From our perspective, we don't think that that information is getting out to the public enough, and that would greatly help reduce range anxiety. We've also talked about the fact that what we think that would help a lot would be to have off-peak charging discounts for electric cars. And so we'd like to have all those come into play. I'll add that Rhode Island has not had a state level rebate for about 3 years, and it's really hurting the market in Rhode Island, and we're trying to get that reinstated as well. So you've got another question or two. Wonder why Newton with 60% default is not in the table. Leslie asked that question. Good question. Our report, which you can get on our website, does include Newton in the document, and it's on our map. They're at 60% green above, or it's 46% green above state law, which makes them 60% renewable energy. And we think that's great, and we cover that in the document. But for the slides, we were talking about communities where we're directly involved, providing the renewable energy resources. We're not directly involved with Newton. And let's see, one last question. Do you have a list of aggregators who aren't and are green? That would be really useful. Yes, if you go to our report, we have the map, and then we also have a list in the appendices listing the communities. And again, this is from our perspective. We describe how we would measure green, and we measure green essentially by the percentage of class 1 resources above that required by law. So that's all in the report at greenenergyconsumers.org/aggregation.
Thank you, Larry. I know we're getting pretty close to 1 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'll move on, but thank you for all the great questions. I do just want to note that because this is in the news recently, you know, transportation emissions, even in communities with GMA, will only be decreased if people are driving EVs, right? And so fuel economy standards have been driving EV adoption in both Europe and California because EVs, to a certain extent, are the only vehicles that can meet the rising standards. In Europe, it's 80 mpge by 2030, which is quite aggressive. And you can see that in the United States. The old Obama era standard was 55 mpg by 2025, which is still pretty reasonable, but now out of date because of the current administration. Trump's new safe efficiency standards set a goal of 40 mpg by 2025 for all vehicles, which is a target that probably would have been hit on its own anyway. And it's likely to be challenged in court. But it is important to know that, you know, without strong fuel economy standards, there's just not that strong push in order to try and get EVs on the road. There are plenty of other policy drivers like the Massachusetts state incentive to try and change that and encourage consumers to switch to an EV. But, you know, we want to continue to have strong fuel emission standards in order to drive that adoption. That being said, oh, I'm not sure why. There it is. Okay. That being said, EVs do have a pathway to zero emissions by 2050, especially if Massachusetts decides to go net zero by then, and gasoline-powered vehicles do not. So by 2050, we could have electric vehicles that are totally zero emissions. So that means nothing from the tailpipe and no upstream emissions from fossil fuel electricity generation as well. And this really all depends on the policy drivers that are on the books. So if state policy improves, we could see EVs all over follow the Massachusetts trajectory that we have in red on the graph here. Rhode Island gets to about 58 grams per mile. EVs charged in Rhode Island get to about 58 grams per mile by 2035 and then drop off there. And so we really want to see that continue to fall for EVs now and in the near future. But what's incredible is that with communities that have GMA implemented, you see that zero emission date being moved up 5 years or even a full 15 years ahead of what the rest of the state is doing for EVs charged in those communities in the next now and in the next 10 to 15 years. So there is a pathway for zero emissions for electric vehicles, and not just for electricity, but anything that runs on fossil fuels and can be converted to electricity. So including heat pumps in the heating and cooling sector as well. And we're running short on time, but the upshot is that EVs are providing significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in New England and also most of the US. I encourage you to play with that Union of Concerned Scientists tool to try and see what the emissions are all over the country. And also in the long term, there's a pathway for electric vehicles to have net zero emissions, so totally emissions free. And then finally, if you live in a GMA community, the emissions reduction benefits of EVs are accelerated and probably more than you think. So EVs are having a greater environmental impact than a lot of people realize, especially in conjunction with the strong renewable energy policies and initiatives that we're seeing on a statewide and community-wide basis. So again, it's 3 minutes past the hour, but I encourage everyone still on the webinar to send in questions via email, either to me or to Larry, who is really the expert on all things GMA. And I can take additional questions about electric vehicles as well that some people have sent in. So with that, Larry, do you want to wrap up and answer any last questions?
Yes, Mel, great job. Thank you for representing us so well. And yeah, I guess we'll take a couple more questions and then we'll probably break off in the interest of respecting people's times. Wayne has a question. Here's a good one. Can you discuss progress on repurposing of EV batteries when the efficiencies decrease to the point where no longer usable for EVs? It's an interesting topic that I just love, Wayne, but I have to tell you, Mal studied chemical engineering at Brown University, and she's better to answer this question than I am. So Mal.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a lot of progress being made on repurposing EV batteries once they're no longer usable for EVs. These batteries have been shown to have long lifetimes, so easily lasting the life of the car. But a battery is considered to be significantly degraded once it's lost 20% of its original range, but 80% of a very strong, very robust lithium-ion battery that was in a car is still quite a lot of energy. I believe that would be for most EVs that are being produced now, about 48 kilowatt hours of storage, which is easily enough power to be able to support household electricity usage for 3 to 4 days, if you were able to plug that storage into your home. So that's a lot of capacity there. There are projects in both Europe and Asia showing the feasibility of these projects. where folks are taking these batteries and using them for grid scale storage. So using them as an additional generating resource in order to help balance the grid and make sure we have enough supply meeting demand. But there's also smaller projects that are taking used lithium-ion batteries from cars and just attaching them to solar panels and LEDs, and creating grid resilient streetlights in the case of natural disasters. So that's something Japan is working on. So it's rapidly developing. There's a lot of potential opportunities for reuse. And really the problem is that, a lot of the batteries that are being manufactured now are still in vehicles. So there's not a lot to play with for people who want to work on these projects, but you'll really see that sector take off in 10 years for sure.
Mal, excellent answer. Bruce asked a very similar question, and I'm glad we took them in the order that we did. He's asking, are there plans for large stationary batteries to replace peaker plants? And yes, there is. Again, led by California, but Massachusetts is getting into it big, and Rhode Island is coming along a bit in terms of making electricity storage a requirement by the utilities, or actually creating incentives for all kinds of market players to have that. So if you want to put solar panels in Massachusetts on your roof, you can also get a little bit more money from the utility if you attach with it some storage. And business customers tend to benefit the most if they can reduce their peak demand. They end up saving a lot of money on their electricity bill. And so industry players are going to all kinds of customers, large and small. And so what we're going to be seeing is, over time, the state policies will continue to ratchet up the storage requirement, just the way that they do with the renewable energy standard. And it's all about shaving the peak. We want it because a small percentage of the hours in the course of a year end up costing us all a disproportionate amount of money to manage that peak, in terms of higher electricity generation cost, higher transmission cost, higher distribution cost, and then there's the environmental aspect. And so we actually expect to see what we call standalone storage developed in many places, oftentimes paired with a renewable energy project. Even offshore wind is going to get paired with storage, and so that we can feed the renewable energy into the grid when we most need it. But as Mal pointed out, what I think is really cool is eventually we think the market's going to develop so that when you buy an electric car and you run it for its useful life as a thing to move you around, you might be able to get a little bit of money back when you sell it, just because it has the value of the battery that can then be taken out and repurposed. And so we're looking forward to that. So the storage requirement that we're going to be having could end up creating a stronger market for electric batteries that first are mobile and then they become stationary.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, that's all of the questions that I see. We are past 1 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, even though all these questions are great. So thanks again for joining us for this noontime webinar. I hope you all were able to learn something and feel a little bit of optimism for both electric vehicles, which are greener than you might have thought, and also all of the great initiatives that are being worked on by policymakers and community members all over New England. So thanks again for joining, and have a good rest of your day.